The Secret of the Old Mill. Chapter 17. What Lester Said. The Hardy boys set out for the old mill on the following morning. They went up the shore road by motorcycle and then turned to the deserted loop that led to the mill on the banks of the Willow River. When they came within sight of the river, they left their motorcycles under some trees by this roadside and went on their way on foot. They had brought fishing poles and fishing tackle with them. "We might as well enjoy ourselves while we're on the trip," Frank said, and making this suggestion. "Besides, it gives us an excuse for being near the mill. There always was good fishing down by the pool near the mill race." They came out of the woods some distance above the mill and began to fish, working their way slowly down the river. By the time they had come within sight of the mill, Frank had caught 2 fish and Joe had caught 1. The mill wheel was revolving slowly, and they could hear the muffled sound of machinery within the building. Down by the pool they could see a lone figure moving about. "I believe that's Lester," exclaimed Joe. "That's who it is, all right," agreed his brother, after a glance. "And he's fishing too." Lester was standing on the bank of the pool, a fishing rod in his hand, and he did not seem to be very enthusiastic about the spot, for there was little eagerness in his expression as he eyed the motionless float on top of the water. Frank and Joe came slowly down the bank toward him, and he looked up at their approach. He recognized them immediately, and a smile came over his face. "Hello," he said shyly. "Hello, Lester," they greeted him. "Any luck?" "Not yet," admitted the lad. "I don't care for fishing anyway." "There's supposed to be plenty of fish in this pool," Frank told him. Lester shrugged his shoulders. "I suppose so. I've caught quite a few, but when you haven't anything to do but fish all day long, you don't care for it so much." "Is that all you do?" asked Joe. "That's all. It's mighty lonesome living at this old mill all the time. Why don't you go down to the city once in a while?" "Uncle Doc won't let me." The boy was evidently lonely and glad to see them. He sat down on the bank and forgot his fishing in his delight at being able to talk to boys of his own age. "Do you go to school?" he asked wistfully. The Hardy boys nodded. "Every day." "Every day but Saturdays and Sundays." "I wish I could go to school. You fellows are lucky." Joe and Frank looked at him and then at one another. This was the first time they had ever met anyone who considered that they were fortunate in being able to go to school. "I suppose we are," admitted Frank with a smile, "although sometimes we don't think so." "Are there lots of other fellows at the school?" "Quite a few," Lester sighed. "Gee, I wish I could go," he said. "But Uncle Doc won't let me go anywhere." "Where did you come from?" asked Frank. "Washington. But even there, I didn't know any of the boys. Uncle Doc keeps me with him all the time, but he says we'll be rich some day, and then I can have all the friends I want." "What does your uncle do for a living?" inquired Joe. "Why, he runs the mill," answered the boy, evidently surprised by the question. "But what does he make? Breakfast food?" "I don't know. I don't know much about it. Uncle Doc never tells me anything." "Did he move any new machinery into the mill?" asked Frank. "Oh, when we first came here, there was a lot of machinery put in. It's all in the back room." "What does it look like?" Joe inquired lazily. "I've never seen it. It's in a storeroom, and they keep the door locked all the time. Uncle Doc boxed my ears once when he saw me near the door." "Have you ever seen any of the breakfast food?" The boy shook his head. "I've never seen it yet. Do they ship it all out?" Lester hesitated. "Once in a while Mr. Markle goes in to the city with some packages, but they're never very large." "Is Mr. Markle related to you?" "No, I never saw the other 2 men before Uncle Doc brought me here." "Is he your real uncle?" "Oh, yes. He has looked after me for about a year now, ever since my father died." "Is he good to you?" asked Frank. "Sometimes. But he won't let me go to school or have any friends, and if I don't do just as he says, he beats me." "What did he do when he lived in Washington?" inquired Joe. "Did he make breakfast food there, too?" The boy laughed. He didn't do very much of anything. He used to go out at night a lot and leave me all alone. Sometimes he wouldn't come back until nearly morning. He told me he was working in a factory, but sometimes funny-looking men would call on him, and they'd talk for a long while. And he's never told you anything about the breakfast food? Nothing. How long do you think you'll be here? I don't know. Uncle Doc says we may be here for a month yet, but he always has his things packed so we can get away fast. The Hardy Boys looked at one another significantly. Was the patent breakfast food enterprise legitimate or illegitimate? From what the boy had said, there appeared to be grounds for suspicion. It did not seem that Uncle Doc was a scientist after all. I wish we were rich now, said Lester. I'd like to go away from here and go to school. I wish Uncle Doc would move into Bayport so I could go to school with you fellows. But I guess there isn't much chance of that. Your uncle is pretty sure he's going to be rich, said Frank. Oh, yes. He's told me so often that we'd be rich some day, and that I could have all the friends I wanted. He must expect the breakfast food to be a success. I suppose so. Has he ever bought any grain from the farmers around here? Inquired Joe. The boy shook his head. No, some people tried to sell grain to him, but he wouldn't buy it. Then what is he making the breakfast food out of? The boy shrugged his shoulders indifferently. I don't know, he answered vaguely. I don't know much about it. He never tells me anything, and he never lets me into the workroom. That's what the sum and substance of Lester's knowledge of the activities of his Uncle Doc and his two associates. The boy did not seem to object to being questioned. It was plain that he was so lonesome that he welcomed the opportunity of talking to someone, and the more the Hardy Boys interrogated him, the more convinced they were that their suspicions of Uncle Doc and the other two men were not unfounded. Doesn't he make you do any work? Asked Frank. I have to chop the wood once in a while and bring water up from the spring. That's not much to do. It's pretty dull here. I wish there was more work for me to do, but mostly I just wish I could swim and hang around. Doesn't he let you help him in the mill? No, I've offered to help him, but none of them will let me come into the workroom. Workroom? Don't they use the whole mill? Only the stone room, where the new machinery is. The old machinery isn't being used at all. No? At the moment there was an interruption. A shout from the mill attracted their attention, and looking up, they saw Uncle Doc standing in the doorway. Lester, he bellowed angrily. Yes? Come up here this minute, ordered the old man. He left the door and came down the slope towards the river. Now I'm in for it, said the boy. I suppose he'll be angry now because I was talking to you. Uncle Doc was indeed angry. As he came up to the group, he was muttering beneath his breath. Get back up to the mill, you young rascal, he ordered, giving Lester a cuff on the side of the head. How often have I told you not to be talking to strangers? You talk too much altogether. Get back up to the mill and stay there. We were just chatting, began the boys. But Uncle Doc silenced him. With an appealing glance at the Hardy Boys, Lester began to make his way back up to the slope towards the mill. Uncle Doc turned towards Joe and Frank, surveying them resentfully. What are you doing loafing around here? He demanded. We're not loafing. We've been fishing in the river, said Frank. Not that it's any of your business, so far as I can see. I'll mark it my business, thundered Uncle Doc. You two fellows had better stay away from here after this. We don't want you hanging around here. The river is free, Joe reminded him. Keep away from around this mill, or I'll make it hot for you. What was the rascal of a boy telling you? We were just talking, replied Frank evasively. Well, don't talk to him again. I don't want him mixing up with all the riff-raff of the country and talking to every Tom, Dick, and Harry that comes round. I'll think you to stay away from here after this. Whereupon Uncle Doc, still grumbling indignantly, went stamping up the slope again towards the mill. The Hardy Boys, not a bit alarmed by the outburst, but feeling that they had gained valuable information that day, began to move slowly down the river bank away from the vicinity of the old mill. Chapter 18. Suspicions. "What do you think, Joe?" asked Frank, as they were speeding back to Bayport on their motorcycles. "I don't think Uncle Doc is a scientist any more than I am." "That's my opinion, too. Why should they have so much secrecy about the new kind of breakfast food? Why wouldn't they even let Lester into the workroom with them? Something fishy about it, and that's plain by now that Uncle Doc doesn't like strangers around the place. That poor kid must lead a lonely life with that gang. It's a wonder he doesn't run away from them." "He has no place else to go, I suppose. He seems a nice sort of chap, too," Joe answered. "Well, we didn't get anything definite from him, but we know enough to make us mighty suspicious of what's going on in that old mill." "I'd like to get a look at that machinery in the secret room the boy mentioned." Frank was silent for a while. "I wish Uncle Doc hadn't seen us there together. It'll make it awkward now if we ever go back. He's told us to stay away, and now he'll be suspicious if he ever sees us around there again. We might tell Dad what we know about the place." But Frank voted this suggestion out. "I'd rather work along our own lines until we get something more definite," he said. "If we get some real evidence, we can tell Dad about it. So far, we have nothing to go on but our own suspicions." All the way back to Bayport, the Hardy boys discussed the various aspects of the case, and although they agreed that the mysterious activities of the three men at the old mill tended to indicate almost anything but scientific endeavors, they realized that if they investigated too thoroughly, they might get into serious trouble. "We'll just wait a while and keep our ears open," Frank decided. "If those fellows are in the counterfeiting game, they'll do something to give themselves away, and then we'll be right on the job." When the boys got home, they amused themselves in the gymnasium in the barn for some time, and had an impromptu boxing match, and finally, after a shower bath, went down the street. It was a sleepy Saturday afternoon, and the city was very quiet. "Nothing much doing round here," remarked Frank. "We should have stayed out in the country. We could go out to the motorboat for a while." "Fine, let's go." But at that moment they heard the whistle of the afternoon express. Like most boys, they had a weakness for trains. There was a fascination about the great locomotive that held them spellbound, and they liked nothing better than to watch the trains that passed through Bayport, and to speculate on the towns and the cities they had come from, or where bound they went. At times, when school became exceptionally distasteful, they had often gone down to the railway station and wished they could board the first train that came by to travel on to strange countries. Somehow they had never been so daring as to do this. Common sense invariably came to the rescue, but the lure of the locomotives and the shiny rails still held them in its grasp. They moved down the street toward the station and came out on the platform just as the express was pulling out. Idly they watched the few passengers who emerged from the coaches, envied the engineer who was lolling majestically in the cab, watched the conductor in his smart uniform, and looked at the people who were boarding the train. Suddenly Frank nudged his brother. "Isn't that Markle?" he asked. Joe followed his glance. Near the steps of one of the Pullman coaches was a familiar figure, with cap pulled down over his eyes. There was no mistaking the fellow. He was indeed Markle, one of the associates of Uncle Doc at the old mill. What particularly attracted the boys' attention, however, was the fact that Markle carried a bulky paper package under his arm. He had not seen them, but there was something so furtive in his manner that the Hardy boys made themselves as inconspicuous as possible in the shadow of one of the pillars nearby. Markle lounged about near the coach, now and then glancing up anxiously, as though expecting someone. Within a few minutes, just as the conductor shouted, "All aboard!" a tall, thin-faced man in a neat black mustache emerged from the coach. He glanced hastily down at Markle, nodded swiftly, said something in a low tone, and Markle forthwith handed him the package. The tall man snatched it from his grasp, turned, and retreated quickly into the coach again. Markle, as soon as this transaction had been completed, gave a shrug of his shoulders as though he had been relieved of an unpleasant burden, and turned swiftly on his heels and walked away. He disappeared into the station just as the train began to pull out. The whole affair had occupied but a few seconds, and had passed almost unnoticed by anyone on the platform save the Hardy boys. Anyone who may have noticed the handling over of the package doubtless attached this to an unimportant act. The Hardy boys themselves would never have given it much of a passing glance had it not been for Markle's connection with the mystery of the old mill. What do you make of that, Frank? Markle must be passing a sample of the new breakfast food. He seemed mighty secretive about it. I'll say he did. He waited until the train was just pulling out before the other man came for it. No breakfast food about that performance. I don't think so either. Evidently, Markle and the gang are in touch with someone in the city. You remember that Lester said Markle came into Bayport every little while with a package under his arm. That must have been the one he was talking about. Well, that's little more evidence to go on. Give them enough rope and they'll hang themselves. I'll just bet dollars to donuts that there is counterfeit money in this package instead of breakfast food. This man Markle looks to me like a crook, and his tall friend on the train didn't look any too trustworthy either. My idea is that they are using the mill as a plant where they turn out the money, and then they give it to one of their men on the train, and he takes it to some other city for distribution. That looks like it may be true, Joe agreed. You could tell that Markle had something on his conscience when he handed the package over. He looked mighty shifty about it. The boys walked back down the street, still discussing the evidence of the day. They spent the rest of the afternoon out in Barmont Bay in the Sleuth. For the time being, they dismissed the affair of the mill from their minds, being content, as Frank had said, that the counterfeiters, if they were such, would ultimately betray themselves. When they returned home that evening for supper, they did not tell their father what they had learned, but Fenton Hardy himself brought up the question of the counterfeit money when he told them that they had afternoon received a telegram from federal authorities asking him to further his investigation. They have evidence that more than $10,000 in counterfeit money was put into circulation within the past 3 days, he told the boys. The affair is going beyond all bounds. And Paul Bloom is still silent? Asked Frank. Can't get a word out of him. I'm inclined to believe he doesn't know anything about the men who are at the head of the organization. I think he was only a tool employed to get the money in circulation. And I wish you two lads would keep on the lookout for any clues. It will help me a lot if we can run these counterfeiters to earth. Then besides, there is a big reward. We'll do our best, they promised. And secretly they wondered what Fenton Hardy would think if he knew how much work they had already done on the case and how much evidence they had already gathered, tending to indicate that the old mill on the Willow River was in some way connected with the activities of the counterfeiting gang. If you can get anything definite in this case, said Fenton Hardy with a smile, I'll be ready to admit that you have some abilities as detectives. Fenton, don't encourage them, objected Mrs. Hardy. Nonsense, Laura, he replied. If they want to be detectives and if they have the talent for it, you might as well try to keep water from running downhill as to stop them. They've done good work for 2 difficult cases already, and I have a hunch that we'll do something on this case too, said Frank with confidence. Chapter 19. The Rug Buyer. 2 days later, an event occurred that brought the activities of the counterfeiters much closer home. Frank and Joe returned from school on Monday afternoon to find their mother in a state of great agitation. The moment they entered the house, they could tell that something unusual had happened, for Mrs. Hardy was sitting by the living-room table gazing disconsolately at a great heap of bills in her lap. "Where'd you get all the money, Mother?" said Frank, joking at her. But this expression became serious when he saw that the anxiety and distress in Mrs. Hardy's face. Her fingers were trembling as she picked up the bills and put them on the table. "What's the matter?" asked Joe quickly. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Hardy got up and walked across the room towards the window. She looked out at the street for a while, and then turned to her sons. "You didn't see a foreign rug buyer around the streets this afternoon, did you?" she asked them. The boys shook their head. "Just came from school," they told her. "We didn't meet anybody on the way." Suddenly Frank glanced at the floor. "Why, you've sold the rug!" he exclaimed in surprise. The living room floor had hitherto been covered by a valuable old Persian rug, as soft as moss. It had been brought by Mr. Hardy when on a trip to the city, but Mrs. Hardy had never cared for it. Fenton Hardy had thought to surprise his wife when he brought the rug home, but in a masculine indifference to color schemes, he had neglected to see to it that the rug matched the rest of the room. Its color was not what Mrs. Hardy wanted, and inasmuch as the rug had been purchased at an exclusive sale, they had found it impossible to exchange it at all. Mrs. Hardy had always said that if she had an opportunity, she would get rid of the rug and purchase something different. However, the opportunity was long in coming. Although she had received several offers for it, none of these had been for more than $5. And as she said, "I refused to sell a $900 rug for that price." Now, as the Hardy boys noticed the rug was gone. "How much did you get for it?" asked Joe eagerly. "I gave it away." "Gave it away?" they exclaimed. Mrs. Hardy nodded. "Not intentionally. I've been cheated." "How?" demanded Frank quickly. Mrs. Hardy motioned towards the money. "I've just been to the bank to deposit that money." "You don't mean to say it's counterfeit?" "So the bank cashier told me." Frank sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "Well, I'll be gosh hanged," he exclaimed. "How did this happen? How much did they sting you for?" $800, answered Mrs. Hardy gravely. Joe whistled in surprise. "How did it happen?" "He came here shortly after you boys left for school," began Mrs. Hardy. "It must have been a little before 2 o'clock." "Who came here?" "The rug buyer. He was a little fellow, very short. He was a foreigner, you could tell by his appearance. He didn't speak very good English. He had dark hair, with little keen black eyes. He came up to the front door and asked me if I wanted to buy rugs. When I told him that I didn't want to buy, he asked if I had anything to sell. He said he was a traveling rug merchant and that he was from the city, buying and selling and trading rugs." "So you told him about the living room rug," suggested Frank. "I just thought of it then, and I thought it might be a good chance to get rid of it and perhaps get a better rug instead. I mentioned that I had a rug and I might sell it. When I told him I didn't think he could afford to buy it, he merely laughed, a very shrewd sort of way, and said that the money was no object to him and that he bought rugs costing as much as $2,000 and turned them over at a profit. So I asked him to come into the house, and the moment he saw the rug, he admired it very much. He asked me how much I wanted for it, so I told him I wanted $900. Of course, I didn't expect to get that much, because that's all the rug cost. But these fellows always haggle over price, so it's best to name a good stiff figure right at the start." The Hardy boys smiled at this evidence of their mother's shrewdness. "He said he wouldn't give me $900, but he offered $700. I told him that his price was ridiculous, but asked if he had any rugs he wanted to trade for it. He looked rather dubious when I mentioned a trade, and said while he carried some medium-priced rugs with him, he carried nothing that could equal the one I wished to sell." "Did he say where he kept these other rugs?" Frank asked. "He said they were at the hotel, but that his more valuable rugs were all in the city, and that he would take a day or so more before he could have them sent here. Anyhow, he said that he would buy the rug from me for $800 and take a chance on being able to sell me a good rug when he should be back into town." "Fair enough," remarked Joe. "It seemed fair enough to me, of course. The rug was worth only about $800, perhaps less, because it has been used for several months. I was under no obligation to buy a new rug from him unless I wished so. I accepted his offer, and he paid me the money. $800. In cash? He seemed to carry a great deal of money in a heavy leather wallet. He gave me the money in 50s and 5s, and I thought very well of myself for making such a good bargain. Until you came to the bank, Frank said. Until I came to the bank with the money. The cashier glanced at the bills and then told me that he was sorry, but he couldn't accept them. For a moment I didn't understand him, because I had forgotten all about this scare about counterfeit money and hadn't given the matter thought. Then he told me that the bills were counterfeit, so there was nothing left for me to do but to come back home, realizing that I had been very neatly tricked. But perhaps you haven't been tricked after all, suggested Frank. It may be possible that the rug buyer didn't realize the money was bad. Did he say what hotel he was staying at? Yes, he told me, but I called up the police and asked them to find him for me. They investigated and found that there had been no rug buyer staying at the hotel all week, nor any other hotel in Bayport, so far as they could find. That doesn't look so good. What's more, they made inquiries at the station and found that a man answering to his description had taken the early afternoon train out. He took the rug with him. Not only my rug, but a rug that he had bought from another woman in Bayport. He'll probably sell them in some other town. Just what he did. They found that he had bought a ticket to the next city, but they got in touch with the police there, and they found that he had sold the 2 rugs to a wholesale firm and disappeared. He sold my rug for $500 and the other one for $300. Did he give the other woman counterfeit money too? Yes. He cleaned up that afternoon's work, remarked Frank. He didn't lose any time in getting away either. If I had only gone to the bank early, it might have been different, said Mrs. Hardy. As it was, I got there only a few minutes before 3 o'clock, and by that time I got in touch with the police, and by the time they had tried to trace the man there, and later found where he had gone, you know how slow they are. It was too late. I guess there's no chance of seeing him back in 2 days with the rug he wanted to sell you, observed Frank. Either he's in leagues with the counterfeiters, or else he was stung himself for a lot of counterfeit money and decided to get rid of it as smoothly as possible. Mrs. Hardy was downcast. I should have been on my guard, she said. There has been so much of this bad money going around that I should have been on watch for it, especially with a big sum like $800. It's my own fault, I suppose, but it's hard to lose that much money. She glanced at the heap of bills on the table. It's not worth the paper it's printed on. Frank picked up one of the bills and examined it. Looks just like the 5 that the fellow passed on to Joe and me at the station, he commented, testing the quality of the paper. It comes from the same source, I'll bet. $800, Joe exclaimed. That's the biggest haul yet. I'd like to have that rug merchant by the back of the neck right this minute. I'd shake the $800 out of him in a hurry. I guess there's not much chance of catching him now. He has sold the rug and made his getaway. Mrs. Hardy was silent. She felt the loss of the valuable rug very keenly, and still more keenly did she feel the ignominy of having been imposed upon after all the warnings that had been circulated regarding counterfeit money. But the rug merchant had been so plausible, and as she was an unsuspecting woman by nature, she had never for a moment considered the possibility of trickery. We'll go down and have a chat with the police, said Frank, getting up, although I'm afraid it won't do any good. Chief Collig will tell us that he is busy following up clues, remarked Joe with a laugh, and that's as far as it'll go. When the boys reached the police station, they found Chief Collig and Detective Smooth in the midst of a game of pinochle and averse to being disturbed. When they inquired if there had been any further information regarding the rug merchant, Chief Collig shook his head. We're following up some clues, he said gravely, but there hasn't been any more trace of him. Not a trace, corroborated Detective Smooth with a portentous frown. Do you think he'll be arrested? Asked Frank. Chief Collig looked up. Of course he'll be arrested, he declared. Didn't I say we're following up clues? We'll have the fellow behind bars all right. I'm working on the case myself, said Detective Smoot, examining his cards. Rely on us, advised the chief. Your place, Smoot. The boys retired. Somehow they got the impression that the Bayport Police Department was not exerting a great deal of effort to try to capture the fraudulent rug buyer.